This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the Pentagon's release of information on UAPs, aka UFOs, and I've got three people who will speak about it. The subject is the UAP files and information and videos released by the United States Pentagon. I have three fellows who are going to be talking about it. In the upper left corner is Preston Dennett, in the upper right is Robert Schaefer, and at the bottom of our pyramid is David Halperin. As I usually like to do before we get into the subject matter, I'll let each of the people introduce themselves, their interest in UAPs, UFOs, and or the Pentagon, and then we'll talk about some of the stuff. So, Preston, if you would first, can you tell us who you are, your interest in UAPs, UFOs, etc.?
Yeah, sure. I got involved in UFOs as a complete skeptic until I found out in 1986 that my family, some members of my family, some of my friends and coworkers were having dramatic encounters. This shocked me. I had no idea. Got me very interested in the subject. I began buying all the books I could find. I joined a number of UFO groups, including MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. I became a field investigator, started going to UFO conventions. One thing led to another. I started interviewing people formally, writing articles. And after 10 years of research, I began writing books. And currently I've got about 28 books out and more than 100 articles, and have become obsessed with this subject.
So, Preston, I assume when you say encounters, you're talking about like the abduction phenomena, Whitley Strieber, missing time, that kind of thing?
Yes, some have had sightings,
Okay.
Some have had very dramatic encounters. Yeah, face-to-face encounters, what we know as grays or missing time, and this sort of thing.
All right,
yeah,
well,
the whole spectrum, really.
Well, that's a subject for another show on UFOs and stuff, so we'll talk about that. Maybe I'll get you back for another show. But in the upper right corner is Robert Schaefer. Schaefer? Is it Schaefer or Schaefer, Robert? Schaefer. And if you could get a little background about yourself, you, and I forgot to mention, Preston's website is prestondennett.weebly.com, and I think it's thebunker.com is your website, Robert. Is that correct?
Right. Well, that's one of my sites. That contains mostly some of the older information. I have a blog called Bad UFOs.
Okay.
Just go to www.badufos.com, and that contains the most recent and up-to-date things that are happening. I've been a skeptic the whole time, and in fact, I became interested in this way back in the 60s. I was in college. I was at Northwestern. I knew Alan Hynek. I was in his astronomy classes. We talked quite a bit. And this was at the time of the Condon Report and all that. So there's a lot of this. And I started doing analysis of certain cases. Then I got to know Phil Klass, of course, the great arch debunker who everyone in ufology seems to love to hate. And I learned a lot from him. We worked on a number of things together. He mentions me a lot in his books. And then I wrote my own book. My first book was called The UFO Verdict back in 1981. It was published by Prometheus. Then there was a revised version of that something later called UFO Sightings. Then my next UFO book is called Bad UFO. It's just like a blog. And that was written about 5 years ago.
Okay, and finally on the bottom of the pyramid is David Halperin. He's appeared a couple of times before. David is sort of in between Preston and Rob. He's sort of more in the UFOs as myth kind of vein. He's a religious expert too. So David, if you could give a little background about yourself, and then we'll hit the ground running.
Yeah, I'm a teen ufologist from back in the 1960s who grew up to become a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, with my area of expertise in Judaica and my special field of interest in religious traditions of heavenly ascents and otherworldly journeys, which I think I've known all along was my old ufology in academically respectable guise. I no longer believe in UFOs, but they have never ceased to cast their spell on me. And much of my work is to understand not only what that spell was for me and is for me, but what it is for millions of other people. And my latest book was published last year by Stanford University Press, is called Intimate Alien, The Hidden Story of the UFO. My website is davidhalperin, as one word, .net, and I blog there bi-weekly, mostly on UFOs, but on other topics, particularly religious and spiritual topics as well.
Okay, well, before I ask you fellows questions, let me just sort of set the table for those who might be watching this in a few years, and this is may be forgotten for people without a UFO interest. Just recently, in the last few weeks, maybe a month or so, the Pentagon released about 15 to 20 years worth of information regarding supposed close encounters between unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs or UFOs as they would more commonly be called, and military constructs. Some people believe that they may be extraterrestrial. Others believe that they're just misinterpreted data. Others believe that it might be other countries or our own black ops projects. Personally, in just researching for the show, I found personally the videos not nearly as convincing as they could have been. And in just looking things up, I came up with things called like the parallax effect, the bokeh effect, in terms of seeing things that a lot of people who are familiar with cameras are familiar with. So it would be interesting whether it is a military tech by us or our enemies, or whether it is extraterrestrial in origin. But it didn't seem to me to be that convincing, the video footage. So let me start. Let me start with Robert, since he's the arch debunker. What is your take on? Because there were three. There was the FLIR one, the Go Fast, and the gimbal videos. You probably know what those are. So let me start with Robert and your take on those videos.
Well, those are videos that were taken with these FLIR forward-looking infrared cameras, and however, if you take what we've seen, like the familiar so-called Tic Tac video, and I should point out that the Tic Tac so allegedly seen in the video is not the same as what the pilot reported seeing. He saw something down in the water. This is a different plane at a different time, got something off in the distance. It really looks like a distant jet. If you take a FLIR image of a commercial jet at a considerable distance, because the infrared is heat sensitive, and it records the heat signature of objects. And so what it does is, if you compare the jet and zoom in on it a little bit, in a different video, if you got an IR of a jet, you see it very much like this when you zoomed it out when you were a long ways off. So that doesn't look interesting. The one, the so-called Go Fast, is really interesting because they're thinking that this little object looks like a balloon or something, a very small little object you can't really see very well. Yeah. And they're saying that it's moving fast, but it's just they're moving past it. The plane is going 400 miles an hour or whatever, and this thing is down below them, and as you pass it, it's going to appear to be going backwards. So I think one of the most interesting things is that the so-called experts of the Pentagon who looked at this and analyzed it didn't even realize parallax effect. They don't wait. If you're going fast past an object that's below you, of course it's going to appear to be moving backwards. Didn't they do even the most rudimentary analysis of anybody who knows anything about optics and photography?
Let me go to Preston then. Now, probably the one that Robert didn't mention is the one where it looks like a top and spinning around. What was your take on these three videos, since those are the ones that are most out in the press?
Yeah, well, I certainly find them interesting. I'm glad the Air Force is talking about this, or the Navy, and releasing this footage. I don't think they're jets. The pilots who saw these don't think they were jets. These things are being tracked on multiple sensors, also visually seen. And if you hear the testimony from the pilots themselves who are watching them, they are impressed. These are trained observers. They know their aircraft. And the Pentagon certainly, I think, is familiar with what you would call the parallax effect and all of these things. These objects are being tracked at thousands of miles per hour. They are not conventional aircraft as we know them. They are turning at right angles. They are hovering. These are just, the ones we've seen are just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to be seeing a lot more of these kind of footage. And I think that it's great evidence that this is something that we don't understand what it is. So I don't think that these are conventional aircraft at all. And certainly the pilots don't. And the instruments are showing that these are not behaving in ways that we would attribute to conventional aircraft.
Well, let me just ask you, President, before I go to David. I was looking up both pro and con, and even in the middle people. That's why I've got a nice diversity here of UFO people. And the thing that I found interesting was what was called the bokeh effect. And from what I could gather from people who've done videos and who are professional cameramen, the bokeh effect has to do with the shape of the iris in the camera. So that if you have a round or a square or a diagonal or a triangular aperture in the camera, when light comes into it, they explained, a lot of these people are saying that the triangular looking UFOs in the clouds above the ship, the Navy ship, is, they said, quite easily explained by the fact of the aperture that this rotating camera is using. And that when you see the camera rotating, you can get the same effect as is seen in the video if, let's say, you just looked at a light bulb and you had a rotating camera. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the pilots are not intelligent or are not observant, but they are not camera experts. They're not visual field experts.
Right. Well, I mean, I totally agree with you. This can distort the shape of the object, but this doesn't distort the way they are moving and being tracked moving. And this is what I think is most impressive about them. It's not so much the appearance, but the way they're actually maneuvering at very high speeds.
How about you, David? What is your take on those three videos released and any of the other information?
Yeah, well, I think I would basically agree with Robert. And I mean, I do not have the technical expertise to evaluate these issues, but I must say that I've been very much impressed by the videos that Mick West has posted to the internet, in which he provides what seems to me quite satisfactory explanations of the videos. In general, I have to say that I find the whole question of how the infrared videos interrelate with the people who claim visual experience, as well as those who have found, who tracked radar targets. I find that the interrelations among those three modes rather difficult to get my mind around. The other day I reread the SCU report on the Nimitz incident, and I could not get clear whether the pilots who went up and who got the FLIR 1 video claimed to have seen it. There was a tremendous vagueness in the presentation. Now, earlier that afternoon, there was a visual sighting, not confirmed by any infrared camera, by David Fravor and his wingman, who was actually a woman, a very attractive and capable woman who appeared not quite for the first time on 60 Minutes as the second a supporting witness. And they told of seeing this tic-tac just above the surface of the water and coming up to mirror them. But that's not apparently they were not the people who took the infrared pictures.
Right.
So I'm really rather confused about how all these relate to one another.
Yeah, Robert, you wanted to say something about that?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the video that we call the Tic Tac is not taken by the same aircraft at the same time as the visual sighting of an object in the water. When Fravor and his colleagues were targeted, the radar was picking up a target that was unidentified at a certain position and up at 28,000 feet or something. When the planes get there, there's nothing there at that location. There's nothing up in the air. So they start looking around, looking around. Okay, well, they see a disturbance in the water. What was a disturbance in the water? I don't know. Some people said it could have been actually a submarine surfaces, you know, in part of these training exercises. It could also be a whale. Whales in Southern California are very commonly seen off the coast. And when they surface, it's possible they could have just seen a whale up there. But anyway, then of course they thought that it was out of the water. But again, it's hard to judge, and then it disappears. So, and you know, Preston's talking about the multiple sensors, and that's true. But you have to look at the consistency across the whole thing, which is what David was getting at. That, you know, can you tie, if you see something on the radar in a certain place at a certain time, does that match up with the visual reports? Generally speaking, it does not. Now, this thing about the bokeh that you were mentioning, Dan, it's a photographic effect, as you mentioned. It has to do with the shape of the diaphragm for an out of focus image. And that's the clue. All of these images in that, the one that it's the green one, the one with the green background and the little triangles, all of those objects are out of focus, or they wouldn't be little triangles, they would be points. One of them is clearly an aircraft that's flashing according to the FAA, you know, specifications for its lights. And if you go, I have this on my website, and Mick West has it also, shows how those objects sort of look like little triangles line up with the stars. That stars, you got Jupiter there, you've got the stars of Scorpius, you've got Aquila, you know, and people having done this, having taken the trouble to lay these out. This is nothing more than somebody goes out at night with a infrared camera or a night vision camera that he doesn't really know how to use, doesn't really know, you know, if it's in focus or not. And he takes a picture of an airplane going over past the planet Jupiter and some stars, and that becomes a great, you know, Navy UFO video. Well, that's preposterous. What it really means is nobody has carefully, there's no expert in photography that really has looked at this.
Well, Robert, let me just, Preston's point, I don't think we see it in the videos, but there have been claims that some of these objects moved something like 60 miles within a few seconds and were picked up by other whether it was planes or ships, I'm not sure. What do you make of that claim?
Well, I don't know which one specifically you're referring to. I know. Let's take example, for example, of the Tic Tac. The planes go to the space at 28,000 feet, where the UFO radar says there's a UFO, and there's nothing there. So then they look down at the water. Well, what the people are interpreting this as being, oh, it moved 28,000 feet in 2 seconds, and that's thousands of miles an hour or something. Well, just because you see an object here and it goes away, and then you see another object here and it goes away, doesn't mean you're looking at the same object, and it doesn't mean it moved from point A to point B. Once people start looking at UFOs and are convinced, oh, there's UFOs out there, everything that they see that looks a little bit odd becomes a UFO.
Preston, what is the most convincing thing to you then that would suggest that these are unidentified flying objects? And when I talk UFOs, are you suggesting alien technology or terrestrial technology?
Well, it's clear it's a technology. These craft are appearing on radar as solid objects that have a heat signature. These are craft as we know them. And we cannot identify who they are. Is it possible that it's a foreign government? Yes, I think it's possible, but all the intelligence is showing no, it's not. This is just the tip of the iceberg. These pilots are saying that they are seeing these things daily. They come very close in some of these cases, It's not just nighttime sightings, many daytime sightings, so it certainly can't be attributed to astronomical objects like stars or anything like that. So, I mean, I think the evidence is overwhelming that we are dealing with some sort of technology, and that, no, it's not ours. If it's ours, the Pentagon would be in a position to know it. And it's clear that it's not foreign governments. This has been watched very closely. These kind of objects have been seen for a very long time. It's not just recently. And this kind of behavior is consistent, stretching all the way back, at least in a well-recorded manner, to the early 1940s, and probably a lot earlier.
Well, President, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go.
And you have to remember, we're dealing with a government that has been covering up and lying about this for a very long time. This is not a matter of speculation. Cover-up is easily proven through the Freedom of Information Act, documents released through the Freedom of Information Act. Our government has been taking this subject very seriously for decades. So to expect to get the whole truth from them, I think is a little bit naive.
Well, just to use Occam's razor, let's assume that there are these physical craft that can move in ways that we don't know. Would it not be more reasonable to think that it is stuff from our government, and the easiest way to get away with these more advanced aircraft or whatever they might be would be to say, oh no, they're UFOs, because people will be looking, oh, there must be ETs, it must be China, it must be Russia. We're not going to look at what the U.S. is doing. I mean, it would seem to me a nice diversion. So are you totally sold, Preston, on that it's not of this earth? Or because to me, if they are craft, to me, that's the likelier thing seems to be that it's probably the U.S., because we, as far as I know, are the most technologically advanced nation.
Yeah, if you were looking at just sightings, perhaps. But this is a continuum. These objects are landing. There are many, many people who claim to have seen humanoids, then taken on board.
Well,
there's I mean, we're not getting into that.
Yeah,
really, but,
but I don't think there was any of this in the Pentagon report, was there?
No.
Okay.
No, they're not talking about humanoids at all. They're talking about simple sightings, which is really interesting to me because these are the cases that really have the least amount of actual, really good, hard evidence. I mean, we've got thousands of landing trace cases, but it's clear. I mean, I've talked to some of these military officials firsthand who were involved in these incidents, and they are absolutely baffled as to what they're seeing. And if this is a foreign government or our own government, they are behaving in ways that we do not
Preston,
do with test aircraft. This is not how we test our most advanced secret aircraft, by chasing pilots around or performing maneuvers and putting on what amounts to a display.
Well, President,
these are not our own.
In any sense. But the question I want to ask is this. Now, there was only one sailor, I think it was, who said that we're seeing these every day. Well, if that's really true, why don't we have hundreds of photos of it? Why don't people just take their cameras out on deck and get pictures of all these things, hundreds and hundreds of them, and then there would be no way to say it's not really happening. What's happening is people get excited. They hear stories about UFOs. They see something they don't understand, and their kind of rational faculties are kind of put asleep for a little while, and their imagination goes wild. And they think, they see an airplane going past the planet Jupiter, and they think it's a UFO. So this is, and as it has been pointed out, this has been going on a very long time. There should have been a resolution to this. The very first pilot sighting, at least the officially recorded one, was 1947, Kenneth Arnold. And since there have been many, many pilot sightings, this is not something new. Giles Whitted and so on, was there 48 or something? A number of very famous pilot sightings along the way. And yet in no case does anything ever come of it. The UFOs always manage to slip away before the evidence becomes too convincing. And that's because there really isn't any evidence there. It's just people's interpretation of what they're seeing. They may be seeing an ordinary object. They may be seeing an object that is an unusual aircraft or a balloon of some unusual kind. But it doesn't take an extraordinary stimulus to create an extraordinary report.
David, let me turn to you, since Preston and Robert are the two ends of the spectrum there. Let me invert the question that I asked Preston. Suppose that we accept that that it isn't just bad sightings or misconceived information. Let's say that there were actually physical objects up there that were some kind of aircraft. I would assume you would probably be more leaning towards what I said, that it's more likely the US or China or Russia that's doing some kind of black operations or something, and that an easy way to distract people from what's really going on is to claim UFOs. Is that more in truck with what you would think?
Not really. No, because my bias, and I'll label it as such, my bias is to say that these things that are being reported do not exist physically, and that what we are seeing is people. What we're seeing is people experiencing something, quite possibly from inside themselves, that is projected out there. I mean, I am struck in the reports of the Nimitz sighting by the two pilots, Fravor and, it would appear now, Alex Dietrich, that the Tic Tac mirrored the movements of the pilots. And this seems to be a thread that runs through a number of UFO sightings. I mean, the one that just comes to my mind is the famous sighting of William Booth Gill and his Papuan parishioners in Papua New Guinea in June of 1959, in which it appears they're quite convinced that the beings they see standing on the flying discs are imitating their own movements. Something of the sort seems to have been reported from that intriguing incident at the Oriel School in Zimbabwe in September of 1994, which to me means that something from inside the observer is being projected onto what they see. So paradoxically, although I've had my doubts as to whether Fravor was telling the truth about what he saw, Mick West unearthed a report by Fravor of a really rather sadistic prank, UFO-themed prank that he played on some hapless campers somewhere, I think, in the California desert. That this seems to me an argument that what he and Dietrich are reporting is something that they genuinely experienced.
So one of the things I did want to ask, and I know a lot of people online have buzzed about it, is why this story seemed to break first on cable television on some dubious channels that are known, like the History Channel and some other channels, rather than the Navy pilots going directly to 60 Minutes or whatnot. So let me start with you, Preston. What do you know what the actual progression of how this story got out came? Why did it seem to come from, like I said, more dubious channels rather than going straight to 60 Minutes and CBS?
Because there is a cover-up. This is a subject that has been very tightly controlled by the people who are covering this up. And people have lost their jobs over this. This is a very, very serious subject, and great effort, a lot of time and money has been spent to make UFO witnesses look ridiculous, like they're lying, hoaxing, hallucinating, misperceiving. This has been the government policy since the beginning. They are doing everything they can to cover this up. This disclosure was not something they did voluntarily. They are being dragged into this kicking and screaming. So I think that's what we're looking at.
But let me
And
ask you, Preston, because you had said something about having it in daytime. As far as I know, that the videos, at least unless there were more videos, I'm just an amateur looking at this. The three videos were all in infrared. If as David said, these pilots described mirroring images by these UFOs, wouldn't their cameras have caught that on, plain old video? That we could say, oh, these UFOs have a marking. It's not just a heat signature, but there's a marking that says, whatever it might say in Alpha Centauri language, if it was. But as far as I know, there have been no daytime release of videos, and yet that's supposedly the preponderance of the evidence. But it's only been 3 of these major videos that I described.
yeah, and there's a lot more than that that have not been released. I would point to an incident in 1962 when the Air Force was conducting a series of high-altitude flight tests with the X-15, April 30th, 1962, when NASA pilot Joseph Walker launched from Nevada, heading towards Edwards Air Force Base. His X-15 was flying at an altitude of 200,000 feet at about 3,400 miles per hour, and reported back that 2 UFOs just passed overhead. And there was another incident just a few months later, July 17, 1962. And in this case, he was at 314,000 feet, and 6 disc-shaped objects appeared in formation around his aircraft. And these were filmed, and we have never seen these films. The best footage is being withheld from us. Sooner or later, it will come out. We have excellent gun camera footage during the day, and we just haven't seen it yet.
But I mean, who's doing it? I mean, if these Navy pilots came out, I mean, are we talking that it's some sub rosa intelligence agency in the U.S. that lets these guys go out and they're just trying to make fools of them? That's what you're trying? Is that what you're thinking?
This, like I said, this is tightly controlled. We're still trying to figure out who exactly is behind this cover-up. But if you examine it closely, it leads to the highest levels within the military, the Navy. These are the guys who have the actual evidence and are covering it up. It's not a matter of speculation. There's been a lot of work on this, trying to get information out, the solid information, and it's very, very difficult to do. Another incident happened at Edwards Air Force Base with astronaut Gordon Cooper when one of these objects actually landed on the runway. He saw the footage, he developed it himself.
No, he denied that. That's not, that's another one of the urban legend. Cooper never.
No, he's never denied it. That's not true.
All right, Jim Oberg has written a bunch about that. We'd have to stop and look it up. Dan, I wanted to get back to something you said, where you said that how the so-called disclosure was being done on the History Channel and so on. That's really not correct. This whole business about the Navy videos and so on started with a story in the New York Times by Leslie Kane, who we all know who she is, a big UFO buff, and Ralph Blumenthal, who is her colleague. He's also a UFO buff and is studying and writing a book, has written a book on Bud Hopkins and so on. And it's called something about glowing auras and Pentagon. Well, even that title reflects an error, because the so-called glowing aura is nothing more than a photographic artifact when you have this bright infrared object and it kind of spills out. So, even back then, there was a problem. We now know that it was Chris Mellon, who was a former Undersecretary of Defense or something, who was also big in UFO business. Now he was affiliated with Tom DeLonge through the Stars Academy and so on. He was the one who leaked these 3 or possibly 2 of the 3 videos, that the famous ones. And so it's a group of believers, if you will, or UFO buffs in government, backed by the money of Bigelow. Robert Bigelow has funded a whole lot of stuff. And so this is what's behind it. It's not that the military said, the Pentagon said, we got to know what this is. Oh, it's Chris Mellon and these other people pushing for it, and Tom DeLonge got all these people together and Al Putoff and so on. And So they've managed to make quite a ruckus about it, but it's not the military that wants this. It's Bigelow, the so-called AATIP, which was a Pentagon UFO study that was revealed in this New York Times article by Leslie Kane and the others. That was actually funded by the government, but it was Harry Reid was prevailed upon by Bigelow. Now Bigelow is a big campaign contributor to Harry Reid. He got a couple other senators to go along. Just found this AATIP program. They have a $22 million contract that basically went out only to Bigelow. Apparently nobody else even knew about it, or nobody bid on it. And then all they did was wrote a bunch of papers on things like anti-gravity and so on. This is all out there. If you read this on my blog, Mick West has it, a lot of other places have this information. So it's not like the military saw this as a problem. It's Bigelow, Robert Bigelow, the billionaire from Las Vegas, saw this as an opportunity to promote UFOs and to get money to study them.
So, Robert, let me just ask you then, but it is a bipartisan committee. Marco Rubio, a famous arch Republican right-wing conservative, was interested in this. So are you saying that this isn't a political thing? It's more just, I mean, what is?
Well, it may have become more bipartisan now, but its origin were, as I said, and to put it in a larger perspective, the Pentagon has been financing a whole bunch of pretty dubious stuff for a long time. They financed remote viewing. There was the Stargate project. John Alexander was one of the people running that thing, and he's well known in ufology. And as well as Hal Puthoff of Target Puthoff and Uri Geller. It's all the same people, the same cast of characters who are promoting this. They got the Pentagon spent I don't know how much money on remote viewing. They thought they could do remote viewing, find Russian submarines by dowsing or pendulums or however you do it, or just go off like this and get images. But the point is that there's a long history of the Pentagon spending money on rather dubious stuff.
I'm sorry, did you say Uri Geller, the spoonbender?
Yep. Hal Puthoff, who is now still prominent in UFO investigations. He was involved with Tom DeLonge, and now he's also been working with Bigelow for a long time. Bigelow had a group called National Institute for Discovery Sciences, has since disbanded. They bought the Skinwalker Ranch, which is supposedly haunted, has strange cryptid animals there and everything. And they went out there and investigated this. And this was at the same time that, well, I guess it was later that he was getting money from Bigelow was getting money from the Pentagon for AATIP.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Robert, you're claiming, in essence, sort of a conspiracy, I guess, to defraud the government for government funds for research. Is that sort of what you?
I wouldn't say defrauding. There was nobody was intending it as a fraud. They were intending it as a research into a subject that they considered to be serious. For example, put off with 0 point energy, the idea that in the vacuum of space there's a tremendous amount of energy that supposedly you can learn how to loosen, to liberate it and use it to propel, starships or some such thing. But nobody is committing a fraud. But what they're doing is they're researching things that I think most people would agree. Certainly, scientists would, for the most part, all agree that it's a pretty dubious value.
David, let me turn to you, since we've both heard from Preston and Robert. What is your take on the provenance of all of this? Robert says that it started with a Time story by a woman who's a believer in UFOs, I presume, as extraterrestrial. Is there anything that you find interesting, pro or con, about how this story actually surfaced, given that 40-some years ago there was the Project Blue Book?
I find it absolutely fascinating. That to me, what happened in December 2017, well, I blogged about it at the time, and I used the Yiddish word Moshiach Zeiten, Messianic times, which is how I would have regarded it as a teen ufologist, that two very sympathetic articles on UFOs were published on the front page, of the Sunday edition of the New York Times, the old gray lady, the newspaper of record, all the news that's fit to print. And this seems to me the first most visible signal of what we see happening now, that UFOs are skyrocketing in terms of public respectability, intellectual respectability. And I believe, I know I'll go a bit out on a limb that I think it is associated primarily. I know Marco Rubio, and you can certainly quote Tucker Carlson as a counterexample, but it seems to me to be associated primarily with the center left. And I also think, and we can talk about this more, that it is connected with the seismic event of November 2016, the election of Donald Trump. So this, to me, is the really exciting story, the story of the UFO as a cultural phenomenon. And it's a story that I am quite certain has not yet ended.
Let me just, Preston, let me just ask you, since you believe that it's extraterrestrial in origin. I mean, I'm not an expert in UFOs or even things paranormal, supernatural, psi, whatever you want to call that, but I certainly have an interest, a cultural interest. I'm more akin to David's point of view. Why, if this has been, as claimed for many years, a conspiracy about the U.S. government covering up things, and we have all of this tech that has crashed, whether it's from Roswell or Corona or all these other sightings, why the hell aren't we a lot farther along scientifically? Because, I mean, I would think that if I'm the president, if I'm Truman, or if I'm Carter, or if I'm Reagan, or I'm the Bushes, and I know we have all this tech, well, I'm going to bulk up on it, and then, you know, we'll squash whatever. I mean, we'll have a one world government, and it'll all be the U.S. There'd be no one that could stand up to it, but it hasn't happened. So how do you reckon that difference between the reality that we have, where the U.S. seems to be, while it's still the most powerful nation, it seems to be losing its hegemony in many areas, with the fact that we would have all this technology that could make us masters of the planet, at least?
Yeah, well, you're asking me to speculate here, but I think just based on the first-hand information we've gotten from whistleblowers within government, that we do have this technology, and it's being largely suppressed. The technology we see within the public arena is not as far along as we truly are. The real technology is being withheld within government circles, within the high military ranks. Senator Barry Goldwater talked about this. He tried to get access to what is called the Blue Room, in which a lot of this technology is being withheld. He was told he did not have the clearance to see this. There's a number of whistleblowers who are talking about this. It's not just one or two. There are hundreds. I've talked to some of them myself. A gentleman who was a subcontractor for the military was at Edwards Air Force Base and saw what amounted to a flying saucer inside a hangar. And he turned to his employer, and his employer absolutely refused to discuss it. The only information he could get out was that this wasn't a UFO from a foreign planet, that this was reverse engineered from alien technology.
So let me just ask you there. I understand the idea that we're not going to, you know, we're going to play coy about what we actually have. But recently, for example, China has made rumbling against Taiwan again, and Japan had mentioned something, and I forget which leader of China said, well, we'll nuke Japan. Now, if we really have this technology that's centuries or eons ahead of anyone else, we'd be like, well, fuck you, China. We're in support of Taiwan. You try to nuke Japan, we'll destroy you. If I mean, to me,
I see what you're saying, but what would happen if we start using this technology is that reveals their hand. That shows that we actually have this technology, and that's what they apparently do not want to do at this time.
But
I think
why?
at some point we will see it.
But why? What would be the rationale for not having? I mean, if I'm the biggest caveman in the block and I've got the biggest hammer, or I'm the gladiator with the biggest sword, I'm going to use it against other gladiators. No.
Yeah, but it's not just the U.S. who has this technology. Most of the superpowers apparently have gotten a hold
Okay.
of this hardware. The Pentagon did say, by the way, that we have material from other worldly vehicles. They kind of backpedaled on this, but I think at some point this will come out.
Okay. Let me turn to either of you that want, and any of the three of you that want to might answer this first, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3. Again, as I said, I've had just an amateur sort of cultural, historical, social interest in whether it's big feet or chupacabras or something. I find it interesting. David and I talked about this on another show. Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, I think, is a fascinating book that takes that kind of view. So I remember in the 1990s, people, when digital cameras start coming on, there was these things called rods that they thought were these living creatures that were flying around in the atmosphere. And it just turned out to be, I guess, the speed of, again, I'm not an expert, cameras, apertures were not quick enough to catch the little lightning bugs or the crickets or whatever it was that were flying by. So when I saw the Tic Tac, and when I saw, like I said, when I mentioned the bokeh effect, that immediately came to mind, is that these were just writ large little rods up in the sky, that it was something. So maybe David, if you want to tackle that first, if you remember the thing I'm talking about, the rods.
I actually don't.
No.
They were called Roswell rods at first, and it's because they looked like, well, I mean, that was just to give them an extraterrestrial explanation. They look like a line, and there'll be like little wings coming out. And basically, yes, that's how the digital camera recorded insects flying by. Yeah. And so this was quite a thing for a while. A lot of people would go out and get their pictures of rods flying by at night. And so but I think that's kind of gone by the wayside the last few years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just ask for some final opinions then from each of you, and then you can give a closing statement here. Let me start with you, Preston. So what do you think is the next step here? The stuff has been put forth before congressional committees. It seems, at least, and you would probably emphasize the seems, that the military is cooperating. They're shrugging their shoulders. They don't know what to do. It seems to me that it seems that they're genuine, but I could see where someone could say there's something afoot here. What would you say is the next step in this research? I mean, is it going to just die in the Senate, or is it going to get funded? And if it's funded, is it just going to be a big boondoggle?
I'm leaning towards the boondoggle. I don't know if our government's ever going to willingly disclose what they truly know. They know what this is. They know it's extraterrestrial. There are incidents like the Malmstrom UFO encounter, in which these objects came down and shut down our nuclear missiles at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967 in Montana. They know what this is, and they are not willing to even say the word extraterrestrial. This recent report is pretty much a complete reversal from the Condon Committee, the Robertson panel, Project Blue Book, which said there's absolutely nothing to this, and it's no threat to national security. They are now leaving open the possibility that this is extraterrestrial and it is possibly a threat. So I think they may put forth the threat narrative in an attempt to sort of gain more funding to study this, but it's disingenuous. They already know what it is. I don't think our government is going to disclose it. I really don't. I think it will probably be another government. This has been pushed into the mainstream. UFOs are not going away. It's becoming an increasingly popular subject. More and more people are claiming contact. The evidence for UFOs is overwhelming. It's in the public arena. It's absolutely conclusive. So this is something that will, I think, at some point, be an explosive story and will change a lot of people's minds. At some point, I think everyone is going to know that we are being visited by extraterrestrials from other planets.
So, Robert, you disagree with Preston probably 180 degrees in what it's what it's about. But you seem to think that this is basically just more government incompetence. So it would seem that. Do you think this is a potential boondoggle that people are going to be looking for funding and it's going to go down into people's pockets, or what?
It's already happened. Back when the AATIP was first proposed in 2008 or something, Harry Reid was the senator who was leading this. It already put $22 million into Bigelow's pocket. In fact, he was supposed to use it to build new buildings in order to house specimens and so on, according to the New York Times stories. I don't think that happened, and whether he thinks he has a specimen or not, it's kind of you hear different things at different times. No, it's impossible to predict what the politicians are going to conclude, what they're going to finally do. But yes, this is basically, it's, never let a good crisis go to waste. If people are convinced there's UFOs, then they're convinced that there has to be a big study to find out what UFOs are. I still want to know if we're seeing things, if the sailors are seeing things every day. I would expect hundreds and hundreds of photos and videos, but we don't get that. So, this is, if you look at not just the Pentagon UFOs, but the Pentagon remote viewing and ESP experiments, and so you find the same people involved. John Alexander, who's well known, has written a book on UFOs, well known in ufology, and he's involved in both of these things, and along with the Skinwalker Ranch and Tom DeLonge and all that. By the way, Tom DeLonge and his Through the Stars Academy, they seem to have fallen on really hard times, and I'm not sure exactly why that is. Now they've moved on, and now so that organization really isn't functioning anymore. But now Bigelow is putting more people onto his payroll and studying these oddball things, including Leslie Kane, who wrote all of those or co-authored all of those New York Times stories about UFOs. Now she's into studying life and consciousness after death, and apparently Bigelow is also studying this, so she's working with him. And she doesn't just think that maybe your consciousness remains. She's talking about actual spirit manifestations with spirit cabinets and trumpets. All this 19th century spiritualism thing is coming back, and she's promoting it. So there's a lot of oddball stuff going on. I don't think, like Preston says, not only the U.S. government, but all the other major governments have crash saucers or they have this information. And there's no leaks out of any of them. There's nothing about these pathetic little leaks of a go fast video is what leaks out from Chris Mellon from our government. And so you got France and Germany, Japan, China, they all have saucers. None of them have any leaks. It's preposterous to maintain
that's one of the things, just before I go to David, that I found. Human beings were social animals, and we know what colors Jennifer Lopez panties are when she goes out on a date. I mean, how do we not know that? But David, what is your
Sorry,
what is your take? So we've had this hearing. Do you think there's going to be a follow-up hearing? Do you think like Robert that some people are going to get rich from funding studies, or what?
I don't know who's going to get rich. I do know. I can guess who's going to draw a salary, and that was the main thing that leaped out at me from this very what's the word? Not inconclusive would be putting it too mildly. 9-page report, which is give me money.
Yes, exactly.
But I would have to say that much as I may disagree with Preston about many things he said, there is one point on which I would heartily agree with him, and that is that UFOs are not going away. They've, just as the ufology community has been predicting some sort of a dramatic denouement or now disclosure for decades, and it never happens. Similarly, the skeptics have been predicting for decades that we're all going to lose interest in UFOs, and it seems clear now that the very opposite is happening. And I think that is because the UFOs are an essential part of who we are as human beings and as I would add religious human beings. And I think this is the real UFO story. And I think it's an amazing and wonderful story.
Well, David, Preston, Robert, you may all have different opinions, but thank you for spending about an hour speaking with me.
Thank you for having us.